Hey, what's up, you guys? My name is Sean, and today we'll be doing a video presentation about the Freedom Riders of the 1960s. But before we start, I'll give you a brief history of what the Civil Rights Movement was and how it came to be. The Civil Rights Movement was a time where African Americans fought for equal opportunities for basic privileges and rights of the U.S. citizenship. Although the movement dates back to the 19th century, it peaked in the 1950s and the 1960s. African American men and women, along with whites, organized and led the movement at the national and local levels. They pursued their goals through legal means like negotiations, petitions, and nonviolent protests. The Civil Rights Movement focused on three distinct areas: education, social segregation, and voting rights. Discriminations like these were very common in the American South. African American population was concentrated, and where racial inequality in education, economic opportunity, and the political and legal processes were more prominent. In the beginning of the 19th century, state and local governments passed segregation laws, or also known as the Jim Crow laws. They imposed restrictions on voting qualifications that left the black population economically and politically powerless. Many leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and former United Senator Robert Kennedy were one of the many leaders that helped fight for the cause of the Civil Rights Movement. The movement was very hard and necessary to gain and protect every rights of people, regardless of color, race, sex, or national origin. Many black Americans, along with many whites, mobilized and began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned for 2 decades. One of the many examples of the Civil Rights Movement was the Freedom Rides. Now I will begin to explain the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides was a massive movement that occurred during the peak of the Civil Rights Movement in the early 1960s. A big obstacle that the black Americans faced during the 1960s were the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. The movement composed of civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into the segregated southern United States to deliberately violate segregation laws. Many black Americans who would travel down to the South would continue to occur in an attempt to use white-only restrooms, lunch counters, and waiting rooms. The Freedom Rides was inspired by the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation. The major difference between the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation and the 1961 Freedom Rides was women were included to join the Freedom Rides to the South. The 1961 Freedom Rides was organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Many other groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, which was a student-led group that began many major protests against segregation in many different states, cities, and communities, also helped organize the Freedom Rides. The first Freedom Ride took place on May 4th, 1961. Inside the bus were 13 riders, 7 black Americans and 6 white, that left Washington, D.C. on 2 public buses bound for the Deep South. The group traveled through Virginia and North Carolina to draw a little public attention to get others to join the movement. But on May 12th, in Rock Hill, South Carolina, 3 members of the Freedom Rides movement, John Lewis, an African-American seminary student and a member of the SNCC, and the white Freedom Rider and World War II veteran, Albert Bigelow, and another African-American rider, were violently attacked as they attempted to enter a whites-only waiting area. Throughout the Freedom Rides, many members would face violence, hostility, and would get arrested. On May 14, 1961, the Greyhound bus was set to arrive in Anniston, Alabama. There, an angry mob of 200 people surrounded the bus, causing the driver to continue to pass the bus station. The tires had been slashed and blown out. The mob forced the crippled bus to stop several miles outside of town and then firebombed it. As the bus burned, the mob held the doors shut, intending to burn the riders to death. Shortly after the Freedom Riders got out of the bus went into flames and they were brutally beaten by members of the surrounding mob. A second bus was to travel to Birmingham, Alabama, and those riders were also beaten by an angry white mob, many of whom were brandished by metal pipes. Many of the injured riders were hospitalized, but were left untreated and kicked off the hospital. Although the incident of the Greyhound was very hateful and traumatic, it had caused media attention and photographs of the burning Greyhound bus, and the bloodied riders appeared on the front pages of the newspaper. When reports of the bus burning and beatings reached to U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, he urged restraint on part of the Freedom Riders and sent an assistant to Alabama to try to calm the situation. Due to the violence, it resulted in a halt in the movement. CORE officials could not find a bus driver who would agree to transport the integrated group, and they decided to abandon the Freedom Rides. Although with the help of U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, he began negotiating with Governor John Patterson of Alabama and the bus companies to secure a driver and state protection for the new group of Freedom Riders. However, radio reports told of a mob awaiting the riders at the bus terminal, as well as on the route to Montgomery. The Greyhound clerks told the riders that their drivers refused to drive any Freedom Riders anywhere. Recognizing that their efforts had already called national attention to the civil rights cause and wanted to get to the rally in New Orleans, the riders decided to abandon the rest of the bus ride and fly directly to New Orleans from Birmingham. When they first boarded the plane, all passengers had to exit because of a bomb threat. The rides finally resumed on a Greyhound bus departing Birmingham under police escort on May 20th. The attacks on the Freedom Riders continued. The police abandoned the Greyhound bus just before it arrived at the Montgomery, Alabama terminal, where a white mob attacked the riders with baseball bats and clubs. Attorney General Kennedy sent 600 federal marshals to the city to stop the violence. The following night, Martin Luther King Jr. led a service at the First Baptist Church in Montgomery, which was attended by more than 1,000 supporters of the Freedom Riders. A giant riot had come outside of the church. With the help of Robert Kennedy, he summoned the federal marshals and got the riot to stop. The violence and arrests continued to gain international attention and drew hundreds of more people to join the movement. The riots continued over the next several months, and in the summer of 1961, Freedom Riders also campaigned against other forms of racial discrimination. Many sat together in segregated restaurants, lunch counters, and hotels. This was especially effective when they targeted large companies such as hotel chains. Fearing boycotts in the North, the hotels began to desegregate their businesses. The riots continued over the next several months, and in the fall of 1961, under the pressure from the Kennedy administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in the interstate transit terminals. Because of this, passengers were permitted to sit wherever they pleased on interstate buses and trains. White and colored signs were removed from the terminals. Racially segregated drinking fountains, toilets, and waiting rooms serving interstate customers were consolidated, and the lunch counters began serving all customers regardless of the race. The Freedom Riders became the backbone of the wider civil rights movement. It helped inspire participation in other subsequent civil rights campaigns. Campaigns like voter registration throughout the South, freedom schools, and Black Power movement were inspired by the Freedom Riders. Thanks to the many Freedom Riders who endured many obstacles, many African Americans were able to stand up, have a voice, and fight for what is right. This is just a brief history of the Freedom Riders. This concludes my presentation. Thank you guys for listening.